Welcome to Module 4, Part 2. In this part, I will review the stop consonants, but first I'll show you the information to look for in order to identify consonants in the mid-sagittal section figures. Nearly all of the consonants of English can be differentiated by examining the mid-sagittal section. Mid-sagittal section figures are provided in the following notes as well as in your textbook for the consonants of English. The mid-sagittal section provides information about the place of articulation and manner of articulation of consonants. Voicing is indicated by showing the status of the vocal folds. For the exam, you should be able to identify place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing from the mid-sagittal section figures. There are only two English phonemes that cannot be distinguished from one another from these figures. This slide shows the information you should be looking for to identify place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing from the mid-sagittal section. First, note the position of the lips. This can tell you about the place of articulation if it is a bilabial or labiodental sound, and can also tell you whether or not lip rounding is present. Next, examine the position of the tongue. The part of the tongue that forms the constriction and the location of the constriction relative to the upper and posterior surfaces of the vocal tract can tell you the place of articulation for the alveolar, palatal, velar, and glottal consonants. Whether the tongue is touching, as in this figure, or merely close to the upper or posterior surfaces of the vocal tract can help you determine the manner of articulation of a consonant. For example, whether the sound is a stop, fricative, affricate, liquid, or glide consonant. Next, look at the position of the velum. The velum will be in the raised position and depicted as touching the posterior wall of the nasal cavity for every manner of articulation for the consonants except the nasal sounds. For the nasal sounds, a small channel will be depicted between the velum and the posterior wall of the nasal cavity, allowing air to flow from the pharynx, here, through the channel and into the nasal cavity. Finally, note the position of the vocal folds, down here. A wavy line indicates a voiced consonant, while a straight line indicates a voiceless consonant. I will review 8 stop consonants for English. You should already be familiar with the first 6. We will take a little more time talking about the last 2, the alveolar flap and the glottal stop. All of the stop consonants are produced by creating a closure within the vocal tract at the place of articulation, and with the velum in the raised or closed position. Because there is positive pressure within the lungs, stoppage of airflow creates a positive pressure behind the closure. If this closure continues for any significant amount of time, vocal fold vibration will stop, although it may continue for a little bit during the stop closure. When the stop is released suddenly, air flows quickly out of the oral cavity, creating a brief, noisy burst of air that can be heard on the release of the stop. Listen as I release a voiced stop in the word dog, dog. For single prevocalic stops in stressed vowels, this burst of air will be longer and noisier for voiceless stops than for the voiced stops. For example, listen to the voiceless T in the word toe versus the voiced D sound in the word doe, toe, doe. Both initial stops have a burst of air following the release of the stop, but it is more noticeable for the T than for the D. That is because the beginning or onset of voicing is somewhat delayed for the voiceless initial stops than for the voiced ones, because the vocal folds take a little time to get into the closed or adducted position. Listen again, voiceless, then voiced. Toe, doe. The location of the constriction, or the place of articulation of the consonant, determines the quality of the noise produced on the release of the stop consonant. It also changes the sound of the vowel somewhat for a preceding and for a following vowel as the tongue moves toward the location of the constriction and then away from it following the release. In English, the places of articulation for the stop consonants are bilabial, alveolar, velar, and glottal. There are a number of variants or allophones of the stop consonants, particularly the voiceless alveolar consonant, as in toe, which has 5 common allophones. As noted earlier, there is a delay in the onset of voicing following the release of the stop for the voiceless single consonants in syllable onsets, particularly for stressed syllables. This delay is called aspiration. This is the version of the T sound that we hear in the word top. Listen how the T in top sounds quite puffy compared to the D in dog, or the voiced stop. So voiceless stops in the initial position in single consonants in a stressed syllable are called aspirated stops. When a voiceless stop follows an S sound, S, in the onset of a syllable, however, the voiceless stop will become unaspirated, or it won't have as much of a puff of air following it. This is the version of the T or T sound that occurs in the word stop. Listen to the version of the T that is produced in the two words again. Top, the aspirated version, and in stop, the unaspirated version. Unaspirated stops may also occur in the syllable coda. However, a stop may also be unreleased in the syllable coda. In some cases, it's optional which version you choose to say. For example, I can say the word pot with either an unaspirated or an unreleased stop at the end of a word. An unreleased stop simply means the stoppage of airflow is not released. Listen for the difference. Pot, released but not aspirated, and pot, unreleased. Again, pot versus pot. However, it's unusual to produce an aspirated stop in the syllable coda like this, pot. It usually means you're trying to overemphasize the word in some way. Pot. Unreleased stops may also occur sometimes in consonant clusters in the syllable coda, like the P in the word leapt. The P is unreleased. I call the P unreleased because I changed the position of my articulators to the position for the T before the stop is released. Here is what the word sounds like with an unreleased versus a released P. Leapt, unreleased P. Leapt, released P. Can you hear the difference? You should learn to recognize all of these different allophones as variations of the phoneme, but you won't need to transcribe them differently until narrow transcription is introduced. This slide shows the mid-sagittal section figures for the voiced and voiceless, bilabial, alveolar, and velar stops in English. The B and the P, the D and the T, and the G and the K sounds are all cognates, so they are identical in their mid-sagittal sections except for the status of the vocal folds. The B and P, or B and P consonants, are made by making complete stoppage of airflow by pressing the upper and lower lips together. The D and the T, or the D and T consonants, are made by completely stopping airflow by touching the tongue blade to the alveolar ridge and raising the sides of the tongue against the teeth so air cannot flow out of the oral cavity. The G and K, or G and K consonants, are made by touching the tongue body to the velum and raising the sides of the tongue against the back teeth so that air is not allowed to flow out the oral cavity. For all three places of articulation, also note that the velum is in the raised position, making contact with the posterior wall of the nasal cavity, so that air is not allowed to flow from the pharynx into the nasal cavity. The arrows show you which of the stops is voiced and which is voiceless.